Hi everyone, welcome to this workshop that is being hosted by the Sex, Health and Society Conference, and with massive thanks to the conference organisers for allowing us to take up this space. I want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Gadigal land, so that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I think that this is a really welcome time right now to really critically reflect on how our Voice to Parliament might provide us with one of the first steps towards a more equitable and appropriate treaty conversation with our First Nations people. But having flown up today from the beautiful lands of Nipaluna, the lands of the Muminaba people, I just think that we just really need to take a moment to acknowledge the amazing custodianship of this land that, we've done our best to destroy. And we really need to return back to our First Nations knowledge in how we can care for this place better. So this is a very exciting moment for us. My name is Karen Drysdale. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Social Research and Health at the Faculty of Arts, Design and Architecture. And joining me today are some amazing panellists who are across the faculties in UNSW. But first of all, I just want to give you a little bit of background about why we're all coming together today. So this is one of the inaugural events of the newly formed UNSW Community of Practice for Inclusive Research with Queer, Trans and Intersex People, or CoPQTI. And this is a group that comprises UNSW academic and professional staff and research students, both LGBTIQ+ and their allies, who hold particular expertise and interests in making research and other engagement and collaboration with queer, trans and intersex people more inclusive. Now, we all know, and we have amazing data to support this knowledge, that the continued explicit exclusion of queer, trans and intersex people from public, social and cultural life has far-reaching implications. And this exclusion often starts with the language that we use in research and associated practices. And so in recognising these challenges, the CoPQT was founded by us with support from the Division of Equity, Diversity and Inclusion to establish a program of activities to build connections and capacity in this much needed area. So the COP is led by myself, Doctors Brooke Brady, Bridget Hare, Andy Kaladelphis, Anthony Smith and Professor Christy Newman. And we have the amazing support and assistance from Izzy Burton-Clark. So aligning with the conference theme of empowerment, relationships and intimacy, this workshop has been organised by the COP to introduce attendees to the general principles underpinning inclusive language and research, and the importance of asking questions around sex, gender and sexuality in culturally safe and sensitive ways. Specifically, this event is meant to showcase the amazing work undertaken by high degree research students here at UNSW. And we're going to be drawing on an array of amazing lived experience, community engagement and professional and research expertise. So while we have this workshop, I just want to remind everyone to pop the questions into the Q&A function and they'll be relayed back to us by the amazing Izzy. And if you want to tweet about this event, and I heartily encourage you to do, please tweet at hashtag CoPQTI. And that's hashtag is on the bottom of the screen that you can see right now. So without further ado, let's get started. What I want to do now is introduce each of our panelists and give them a short, quick rapid fire round of introducing themselves and the research expertise. So first of all, I'd like to start with Yasik. Yasik, what do you do at UNSW? What do you do in your life that makes you such an amazing person?
Hi, so I'm Yasik and I'm a non-binary and queer person. So I'm a PhD student at UNSW, but it's actually not in the LGBTQI space. I'm actually doing a PhD in Aboriginal health in housing and health within the Gunamana HEAL, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Program at the George Institute for Global Health, which is affiliated with UNSW. But I've always, like in the last 5 years, as a public health researcher, I've kept a toe in LGBTQI plus health research because I have a lot of lived experience and also have public health expertise. So I've worked as a peer worker at an LGBTQI plus sexual health clinic at Checkout in Sydney. I've also been a community researcher on Swash, Lesbian, Bisexual and Queer Women's Health Survey, and I'm currently on ACON's Ethics Research Committee. And I guess what I'm most interested in is thinking about all areas of health research and practice, is how does research and how do services support the needs of specific communities, whether that's in the work that I do with housing and health around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in social housing, or if it's to do with like all matter of trans and gender diverse people and queer people across all the different health research areas, and doing that while also recognising the diversity within those communities.
And important to note, you think Swash is the longest running lesbian and queer women's sexual health survey in the world, isn't it? So
apparently
fantastic that you've been part of that. I heard a rumor that it actually came out of some really old performance scenes back in the day. The need to sort of collect sexual health information so they can better serve the people that attended. Okay, next up, I'd like to introduce you to Bella. And Bella is tuning in all the way from Berlin, where they are on annual leave, I believe. So we're very, very lucky to have Bella. I have no idea what time it is over there, but you're looking very, very...
11 a.m.
Oh, perfect timing. Would you like to introduce the work that you do?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Bella Bushby. My pronouns are she, her, and I identify as bi+. And I'll explain why that's relevant in a second. I'm a sexual health nerd who has a professional background in HIV policy and research, and I've worked in the community sector and government sector. I now work at the Kirby Institute here at UNSW as a senior project officer, and I've just started my PhD earlier this year looking at the sexual health and HIV needs of bi+ people in Australia. For those who haven't heard of the term bi+, it's relatively new, and it's an umbrella term that describes people who are attracted to more than one gender, such as bisexual, pansexual, and polysexual people. So basically anyone who isn't gay or straight. And despite large numbers of people identifying as bi+, we are the largest group in every LGBTQ+ survey. There is really a limited amount of bi+ specific research focusing on sexual health and HIV needs of bi+ people in Australia, especially. My PhD research will use a mixed methods approach, mostly quantitative data, but a little bit of qualitative, to contribute to addressing these gaps in knowledge and to try to understand a bit more about what the sexual health needs of bi+ people are and what are some strategies that we can employ to provide appropriate sexual health care in Australia. I've also had the amazing opportunity to work as a project coordinator on the upcoming study. It's called the Bi+ Sexual Health and HIV Study, but it's affectionately known as BISH. The study is being run by a group of researchers led by Dr. Benjamin Bavington at the Kirby Institute and alongside researchers across Australia and UNSW with experience in bi+ people in sexual health. These researchers are partnering with the bi+ community to run a national cross-sectional survey. It'll be online and anonymous and open to any person who identifies under the bi+ umbrella. And yeah, I guess my passion is bi+ sexual health. It's a really important area of research. We know the bi+ population is big and it's growing, especially among young people. They're the future. And again, in every new large survey we see, the proportion of young people identifying as bi+ increases. So I'm going to be focusing on that today. Thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to the panel.
Thanks, Bella. And, I think it's really important to point out that despite the numbers of people who identify as bi+, they have some of the worst sort of mental health outcomes in Australia among some of the more marginalised groups in society. So I think well overdue research. I'm so excited that you're doing this. I would now like to introduce Ange. So I'm just going to scroll past my screen so I can see Ange's amazing face. Take it away. Introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Yeah, my name's Ange Griffin. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a research assistant at the Gendered Violence Research Network, which is a network run out of the Faculty of Arts, Design and Architecture. I am really excited to be here because unfortunately a lot of my research involves LGBT communities. Sexual violence and gendered violence unfortunately does affect that community at a much higher rate than sort of the general Australian population. And so even though I personally don't have lived experience as part of the community, I think that's really important to recognize first up. Unfortunately, that community is incredibly well represented in my research. So currently I am working on a national survey of LGBT specific experiences of sexual violence. And that national survey is the first of its kind to study the LGBT community specifically. So that's really exciting. It's open at the moment, so everyone should complete it so that we can have some much needed data in this area. And yeah, in other parts of my research, I've been involved in particular with queer collectives at universities. A lot of my research also includes writing of policy and also training for universities. So Gender Violence Research Network does research as well as sort of professional provision of services. So a lot of my work is also with young queer people, and that has been an incredibly fulfilling part of my experience in the last couple of years. Yeah, so that's me.
Fabulous. And am I correct in that the new survey that you've launched has a particular First Nations kind of perspective or collaboration?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. We have two really fantastic First Nation researchers who are really specifically kind of going out into community and making sure that the queer First Nations experiences are specifically captured, because we know those communities are our most vulnerable.
Fantastic. Great. Now, Heather, if you have been anywhere lurking around the sexual health area, then you would have probably heard Heather speak previously. So it is a great pleasure to have Heather here with us today or tonight.
Hi, I'm Heather McCormack. I am a Wiradjuri queer femme dialing in from Bidjigal country today. I have a long history in queer organising of queer community spaces. And as Karen said, I've worked in sexual health for 15 years or so now, which kind of by necessity involves working a lot with, I want to say the LGBT community, but we all know that it means some letters more than others. I'm currently on the home stretch of a PhD with the Kirby Institute, which if everything goes according to plan, I'm going to submit by the end of the year, fingers crossed. Like Yasik, my PhD is actually not on an LGBTQIA plus related topic. I'm researching STI testing in routine health assessments for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people. But, you know, through my my work with the New South Wales STI programs unit, I'm doing a lot of work in that space, and I've also got a bit of a side hustle doing some casual academic work with the Kirby, and I'm currently writing up a qualitative study on Aboriginal LGBTQIA plus young people and their understandings of sexual health. So I don't have a lot of free time. I don't know if that was clear from that introduction, but I'm really looking forward to the discussions we have tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have just been listening in for all whenever Heather speaks, and I'm really hoping that they'll be able to share some of the or share her unique experiences around, I guess, how these kind of acronyms are translated into other non-Western contexts and whether or not they make sense. And that's actually a really good segue into the last, but definitely not least, panelist today. Ashraf is doing some amazing research, and so I'd love for him to be able to explain that to you today.
Hi, everyone. So thanks, Karin. So my name is Kazi Ashrafuddin. I am from Bangladesh. So I am technically the only Global South researcher here in the panel. So now I'm in Australia doing my research in the Global North. My pronouns are he, him. So in my PhD, I'm doing a PhD in the School of Law, Society, and Criminology in the Faculty of Law and Justice, and I'm also working as a casual academic. So my research, it involves the South Asian gender diverse community called the Hijras. So it's basically a qualitative research that involves like multi-methods involving fieldwork and ethnography. So of course, in Bangladesh, in this case, in the global South. So I had to go back and forth to Bangladesh and Australia for my fieldwork. So I would like to see how different are the gender diverse communities in the global South from the global North, and what are the cultural specifics and cultural nuances. It's not only like cultural, but also like anthropological nuances that we need to understand for a better understanding of the gender diverse community in the global South. So in so doing, I have to look into how different community or cultural factors it shape the Hijra identity. And in so doing, I have to also go through the intra-community and the inter-community power dynamics within the gender diverse communities in Bangladesh, which is related to the queer politics or the gender politics going on in the global South. So I was initially trained in cultural studies and literature. So during my training of cultural studies, I got interested in gender studies. In 2012, I was always intrigued how culturally diverse the gender expressions and expectations are across the borders. So that was the preliminary curiosity that intrigued me doing further research in this field. So in terms of community engagement, I'm also engaged as an ally with the gender diverse communities in Bangladesh and in upholding their rights and causes, because the gender diverse community still, in terms of the legal allowance, is still in a dilemma and in a lot of crisis there. So the legal issue is very crucial in understanding the gender condition, the situation in the global South. So that's me. Thank you.
Well, you've already had a shout out from the audience with us today, Ashraf, so that's great. People are very, very happy to see the Global South represented here on this panel. Now, I've had the amazing privilege of working with these panelists over the last couple of months trying to get this event set up. So what we're going to do is we're going to move through a couple of topics that we've all thought were the most important kind of broad umbrella ways to start getting into the nitty-gritty of these questions. So I'm going to ask the panelists a couple of questions around these broad areas before we move into Q&A from the audience. So bear with us, because you definitely want to hear the answers to these questions, because they are really still on the ball. Like, these are amazing, well thought out responses to these. So let's start. Now, when we start thinking about research, we have to start thinking about the hypotheses and the research aims and the research questions that we want to answer. And we often think about this as the research design phase. But I think even before we even start designing research, we're already starting to think about what are the types of information that we want to have answered, what type of questions, where we want to get our data from. And so we want to start thinking about how we should be thinking with sex, gender, and sexuality in mind. Now, this is something that we always need to do throughout an entire research project, and we often go back and forth and we redesign and we tweak depending on what our data says. So this is not in any way a kind of a linear progression from the start of a project to the end of the project. But it's really important when we're starting to think about the research design and thinking about terminology. What are the terms that are most helpful, that are resonant, culturally resonant, and inclusive when we're talking about sex, gender, and sexuality? So thinking about the word queer, for example, the recent Australian Bureau of Statistics have established the 2020 standard. So these are questions, or a set of questions, that are intended to standardise the collection and dissemination of data relating to sex, gender, and variations of sex characteristics and sexual orientation. But yet queer is not actually used in one of the drop-down boxes for people to describe their sexuality. Now, they can definitely put it in as an open box response, but the reason for that is that we are looking at different ways that people relate to terminology, right? And that queer for some people can also be something that's felt or perceived as quite derogatory. And so I guess one of the questions I want to start with is how we can respectfully and meaningfully ask questions about sex, gender, and sexuality. And I want to throw to Yasik to start answering this question from the outset, if that's okay.
Wonderful. I love this question, I guess also because I feel like that kind of concept and early design of a project is the most important part before you actually dive into, getting into data collection or anything like that. You really need to think deeply about, who the population is that you're thinking about studying, if that's your own, from your own community, or thinking about intersectionality within the community that you're wishing to study. So I guess for me, the important thing to think about in health research generally is that gender and sexuality are not static over a person's lifetime, and that the terms that we use to describe ourselves, they change over time as society changes. And I would say that this is especially true, or maybe it's more obvious in the LGBTQI+ community. It's ever evolving, and the questions that we design today for research, like surveys and that sort of thing, will likely be outdated in a couple of years. So, terminology lists and like the ABS standards are useful in that they point you in the direction of the terms that are appropriate at this point in time. But you always have to be aware of, this point in time, sociopolitically, in, the dominant white Australian culture generally, we're still in a very Western worldview within Australia, and who are you actually, are those questions actually going to be appropriate for all the groups that you're thinking to do research with and for. But the standards are useful. I do understand there's a big push to standardize data and to have data, especially that's comparable across data sets. So if one researcher over here is doing a project, they're using the ABS standards, and then someone on the other side of the country is also using the ABS standards, it's kind of useful then to be like, okay, well, these, we can roughly compare them to some degree. And it's especially important for the trans and gender diverse community so that we can actually start being seen in data in a meaningful way. So that's through the two-step method. So asking about a person's gender and then asking about what they were assigned at birth. So actually seeing how many trans people are actually in the data is really important. Otherwise, we actually just don't know. And of course, it's important for lesbian, gay, bisexual and queer people to be captured as well and track how we're doing over time in terms of mental health. However, it's not perfect. And sometimes I worry that people are just, plucking the ABS standards and popping them into their research surveys, and they're not thinking deeply about what's most relevant for the groups of people they're trying to recruit, and then what they're actually going to be doing with that data and how they analyze that data. And I worry that there's a sense of, we had this whole consultation process to develop the ABS standards, and it's not acknowledging necessarily that the community changes the way it uses language. And sometimes the words themselves change, but also the way we relate to the same words change over time. So queer is a really perfect example of this. As you were saying, the word queer became, it began as a slur. And now there's a whole new generation of sexuality diverse people who are using this term as an empowering term, as a political term. But for older people, it's still considered offensive, and they don't want to say that they're queer necessarily. So you have to be really careful with the words that you use. And I imagine that's why it's not in that drop down within the ABS standards, but it is in the other terms that you can use alongside queer. There's also asexual and pansexual that are considered the more common terms that you can use. But to answer your question, so how do we respectfully and meaningfully ask questions about sex, gender and sexuality? I think it really depends on who your target population is. If you're doing a general population survey, which, will have LGBTQI+ people in it, whether or not it's, LGBT health research, you might want to start on the conservative end and just use the ABS standards and allow people to put in drop down, like have the, I use a different term for my sexuality, and then they can write in queer, and then you can see how many people actually say queer. And I think, if you're going for a younger generation of a particular part of the queer community, you might, lesbian, bisexual and queer women's survey, for example, with Swash, although that's generally for women, you might want to include queer. And actually, I just want to say that queer, so Swash has been around since 1996. happening every 2 years. And it started to notice that people were wanting to write in queer, but that wasn't an option. And so in 2010, Swash actually introduced queer as an option for sexuality. So that's kind of an example. And over time, it's actually increased. So yeah, I think in 2020, 20% of the 1,500 respondents said that they were queer, compared to 9% in 2010. So it's really interesting to see this trend over time. That's one of my favorite Swash facts.
Yeah, that's really important. I think that's a really great example of how these terms don't remain stable. But there's also sometimes a bit of a worry where certain terms get conflated or they get misunderstood. So, for example, when we are talking about sex, you know, sex is technically a legal status, right? And so maybe often it's more appropriate to be asking about sex characteristics rather than the legal status. And while the two-step question is really important to identify people whose gender may be at odds at the gender presumed for them at birth, we have to sort of ask ourselves, why are we asking these questions? What do we need to know? Do we need to know someone's sex? Do we need to know someone's sex characteristics? Or is it more appropriate that we ask questions around gender? And so I guess, you know, you did touch on the idea that we have these longitudinal and cross-sectional surveys, which provide that stability of data collection across those different facets. But what's the best way to ensure that the words that we're using reflect the participants that we want in our research to hear themselves being spoken to see themselves represented in that data? So it's a bit of a twist on what I originally wanted to ask you, because you just managed to answer it so comprehensively.
I think is a kind of couple of things. So, or maybe even three things. Or one is kind of speaking to what you were just saying, like, is it a longitudinal study? Is it something that you're going to be capturing over time, a particular population that you want to see how they're doing over time? Then it might be more important to think about the language that you're using today and how it's going to track over time, but accepting, unfortunately, that over time it's going to change. And sorry, like, there's no easy fix for that. And all you can do is at this moment in time, you know, you got it right. But then the other two things I wanted to say around that is you have to do some deep thinking. You really need to consider who your research is with and for, and carefully considering the diversity within the population. So rather than imagining that, you know, you're assuming homogeneity around your diverse group, because you see, like, a lot of what I'm lightly going to call smugness is like, there's some like smugness in the LGBT research world sometimes, where it's like, well, we're the diverse group or something, and like, we already are diverse, and so there's not much room sometimes to consider experiences that are intersecting. So like age, ability, ethnicity, cultural background, like these things don't always come into play when we're actually designing surveys. And if you look at, you know, LGBT health research across Australia, a lot of it is actually run by white people. And so that also changes how we see things. And so the third thing I want to talk about is consultation. So you really need to consult with people who are within your group and going as wide and deep as possible. So, for example, I know at the moment the Gay Men's Periodic Survey is undergoing some changes, and they're interviewing gay men as well as bisexual and queer men, and also non-binary people, about these changes. They're actually going through the survey with someone and saying, these are the changes we're thinking to make. How does that make you feel? And, you know, trying to be inclusive of a wide range of experiences within that population of people who have sex with gay, bi and queer men. And, you know, obviously we don't have the resources to do that, but it's a really great start. But also like needing to consult even more widely and thinking beyond just, you know, who you see like in Darlinghurst or Newtown, like thinking like who else do you need to be talking to?
Absolutely. That's a really important point, because what I assume of a particular gender identity that I hold or a sexual orientation that I hold may not be the same as somebody else who may even use that same terminology, right? It could be very different experiences. So it's absolutely important that we talk to the people with whom we're doing this research to make sure that we're getting it right. And this is a really good point to move on to start thinking more about the non-Western context and really what has been a historical imposition of colonialist ideas of sex and gender and sexuality. So, for example, in some cases in some Indigenous or Global South context, for example, those words just don't have the same kind of meaning that we assume that they might have. And so I wanted to talk to Ashraf especially here about his research, because one of the things that I think is really important is that we can't just assume that the term trans is something that can be translated across various different cultural contexts. So how can we be thinking about cultural safety and cultural diversity when we're designing research and thinking about research?
That's a great question, Karin. Especially, I can share my own experience while doing this research, because sometimes I also use the term transgender in my research. But then again, I thought about the popular perception or the contextual understanding of the Western terms in Bangladesh, in the global South. Then I can feel the tension. And sometimes even terms like transgender or trans woman, they might even evoke suspicion among the ethnic diverse community, like gender diverse communities. For example, the word, the prefix trans, it evokes a kind of transformation. So you see, so transformation in the form of like medical or surgical reassignment. So this medical or surgical reassignment or any sort of transformation or change is religiously contested sometimes. So there is a kind of tension in any sort of transformation. So when you say hijra, that is more accepted. But when you say transgender or trans woman, that might create a kind of tension. So we need to be very careful whether we are like generalizing or homogenizing the gendered expressions or expectations. And of course, the localized and contextual understanding about the public perception about gender diversity is very crucial to have. So as my previous speaker said, to have some sort of consultation with the locals is very crucial. Having the cultural nuances in gendered expressions and public perception is very crucial in understanding this. And also, we need to respect the cultural and localized nuances while imposing the mainstream or the global north terminologies. So at the same time, I think to me, when I went into the field, then I felt that tension, because at the same time you have the gender diversity activism by different NGOs and development organizations, which are mostly from the global north. And at the same time, you also have the community-based organizations who are working locally with their own community people. So here you have a kind of power dynamics between the Western terminologies and the global South terminology. So this tension, this power dynamics has to be decoded, has to be understood in doing any such research on the gender diverse communities in the global South. So, and at the same time, I would say the very localized, very contextual understanding or intersection or understanding through intersectional lenses also helps the researchers to get a better picture of the field. So yeah, and as a researcher, I always feel that, well, cultural sensitivity is something that always helped me to get into the field and talking to the people and the community people. So what I'd like to say, we should have some sort of knowledge about the localized gendered expectations and also how the Western terms are understood and what are the diverse ways that people in the global South, they prefer to identify themselves as. And at the same time, it's also important to understand the development activism, which are mostly from the global North, how they're functioning in the global South, because there's a very direct impact of development activism on more, I would say, kind of westernizing the perception. So now when some people who used to call themselves Hijra or identify themselves as Hijra, because when you call someone Hijra involves not only the gender diverse expectations or expressions, it also involves cultural performances, ritualistic performances. Even we call it Hijra Giri, that means Hijra occupation. So they have a particular gender diverse economy as well. So at the same time, they also worship different spiritual deities. So here there is a question of deity. Religion is also very much intersected in Hijra identity. So if we say I would like to do a research on transgender community in Bangladesh, so that will be a very problematic statement because it might generalize or homogenize or even erase many different gendered expressions and cultural affiliations with gender. So here, gender and culture are very much intersected, and this complexity has to be understood while undergoing any research in the global south, in my opinion.
Absolutely. So words matter, but words aren't static, and that they change in different contexts, right? Yeah. But back in the old days, the good old days when research methods were written by white, middle-aged dudes who are now dead, there was this notion that you have this kind of just uncover the facts, right? But we now know that research is political. The research that we do is a political project. We can't claim some kind of neutrality and objectivity because we are part of a society that on which we research. So I wanted to ask you, Ashraf, what does a decolonialist approach to research look like from your perspective?
Sometimes when I hear this term, decolonialist approach to methods, then I ask myself, am I really going to decolonize everything, change everything from what the global north has given or has adopted? Then my answer is, probably not. So the positionality I have, that I challenge epistemic or methodological hegemony. So that is my position. I mean, well, the methods can change, it can evolve. Even when I applied for my ethics application, some of the methods have evolved over time during my fieldwork. So I would say what is important, not to impose any sort of episteme, any sort of knowledge, and also like respecting and representing the local knowledge. So for this, what I did, I involved the community people in my research, and sometimes they even advised me on my, if not method, but also strategies. So these strategies really helped me to navigate through my research, and it facilitated my my access to the community. So and so this is one thing that we need to avoid any sort of methodological or taken for granted methods or taken for granted episteme or knowledge. On one hand, on the other hand, I would say the researcher and research participants, the relationship, there should not be any sort of domination or hegemony or hierarchy between these two classes. We should work on that. And the researchers should not adopt any sort of paternalistic approach of the superior or global norm or whatever. So this, I would say this hierarchy should not be there. So that is one thing. And at the same time, we should also choose methods that ensure cultural safety and, of course, quality data. So safety is very crucial. But at the same time, sometimes when I applied for my ethics application, I thought sometimes the definition of safety has to be, rethought from the global south perspective. What really, if we say, well, it is safe to talk to your research participant in a restaurant. So in my case, that was not really a safe space because that was considered to be a cisgender space, and there's no access to, well, gender diverse community. Well, there is legally, but, well, culturally, perhaps not. So for me, I have to redefine the definition of, culturally safe space or safe space. Because for me, the safe space was perhaps the participants' place, or when I went to the refugee camp, it was not really the participants' house, which was the safe space, because if the neighbors see that, well, a researcher came to a place, that means you are gender diverse, that means you are criminal. So you have to be punished for that. So I have to go farther away to a safer space. So I think with some words like some ethical word like safety, consent, they have to be understood from Southern perspective, maybe, and through Southern theories if possible. And last thing that I would like to mention, we need to go we need to think about the institutional. Shall I use the decolonization? I'm not sure, but in terms of the formation of the ethics committee. Why I say this? Because maybe when you have a case, a research, an application, an ethics application from someone like me, who is going to undergo a research in the global south, then perhaps an expert who's expert in global south research can be employed as ad hoc or as invited guest or something. So this is just my idea, what I thought. And of course, I would say my ethics application was an eye-opener for me. I learned so many things. Yes, there was many questions asked by my committee, but I learned so many things. And at the same time, which I realized, when you convince with your own argument, then the ethics committee accepts it. So which is very eye-opening for me and entertaining and enlightening for me, because, well, I had 47 questions from the ethics committee, but I addressed those and the ethics committee accepted my argument. So this is the kind of academic dialogue, academic exchange. So which of course gives us a lot of understanding about each other's context and situations. Yeah, that's what
absolutely.
I would like to say.
I mean, your supervisor has just told me that you had a current record for 48 revisions requested on your ethics application. I'm surprised that you pursued with it after all that. I want to throw to Heather now, because Heather and I have had some, and all of us really, have had some amazing conversations around how we understand gender roles in different non-Western contexts here. And so I just, Heather, I know that I had a few questions here for you, so I'm maybe just inviting you to speak more generally on this, if you can, or if you can even summarize what is a very complicated kind of argument for Western and for people from the global North to understand. But in your research, can you talk to me a little bit about how you navigate those tensions?
Yeah, so I guess the challenging bit is distinguishing between gender identity and gender roles and behavior, because I find that in a Western paradigm, there is a big focus on gender identity as being the kind of the central focus of what a person's gender is. And we don't see that reflected in all cultures. There's kind of an assumption that this is a universal norm, that a person's gender is determined by their gender identity. In some of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures that I've worked with, so the way I've described this before is that we see people who are what is often termed in research behaviorally bisexual, but they don't identify as bisexual. They don't consider themselves to be heterosexual people who are having sex with same-gendered people either. They just consider themselves to be men or women. And that's not a statement of identity. That's a statement of alignment with a cultural role. Man is a cultural role and woman is a cultural role. And that's seen as a more important statement of who you are and how you fit into a community than what your identity is. It's a more relational understanding of gender. And I find a lot of non-Indigenous people have a bit of trouble getting their heads around this, because there is a bit of a stigma attached to the idea of a gender role. And I find that when non-Indigenous people talk about gender roles and how they're bad and how we should get rid of gender roles and focus on gender identity, what they're really talking about is gender norms. They're saying the idea that a man or a woman behaves in a particular way is bad. But there isn't really a Western equivalent to the way that cultural gender roles operate in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. I've been doing some work on a communications program at the New South Wales STI Programs Unit that's focused on heterosexual men who have sex with men. And we've done, so this is an academic research project, but we've done a number of rounds of consultation via a market research process. And we found this really interesting disconnect where when we were predominantly talking to Australian-born, presumably Caucasian, heterosexual men who have sex with men, they had a very strong attachment to their heterosexual identity. They needed to be seen as straight men who engaged in a behavior that didn't detract from their alignment with that heterosexual identity. And when we kind of for reasons I won't go into if it matters in the interest of time. But when we moved on to speaking more specifically to men from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, specifically men from Mandarin speaking backgrounds and men from Arabic speaking backgrounds, we found that strong attachment to the heterosexual identity was far less likely to be there. A lot of the men we were talking to when we spoke to the culturally and linguistically diverse audiences didn't think of themselves as having a strong heterosexual identity at all. A lot of them were like, oh, I think of myself as a gay man, but I would never tell anyone that. We found we were speaking to more closeted men. And particularly in the Arabic speaking group of men, we found a big proportion of men who, again, said they just perceived themselves as men. Because like if they were asked, they would say they were heterosexual, but that was because in their language that they spoke to their family and their friends and their community in, there is no term for gay or homosexual that isn't insulting. So having that like a lack of that positive affirming framework in language affected how they thought of themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is such fascinating stuff to consider. So this goes beyond cultural safety, as Ashraf had said, and it also just goes beyond, just checking in with aspects of a community because they're not homogenous, right? Because they're going to be, the meaning that we attach to things is going to shift and the emphases that we attach as well. So for things to be culturally resonant, they have to actually sort of pay very close attention to the words that we're using. So just before we end this section, I just want to throw over to Yasik because I'm really fascinated by this. I've been following Swash for ages. Now, Swash is a great example, right? Where you've got some clear tensions between identity and behavior, where they overlap and where they don't overlap. And Swash had a pretty unique way of dealing with this. Can I give you just a couple of minutes to sort of give us some updates around the longest running lesbian sexual health survey in the world?
Sure. Well, I was also just really enjoying hearing Ashraf and Heather talk a lot about the kind of nuances around terminology and things just don't fit the Eurocentric hegemony, as someone was saying in the chat. It makes so much sense. And when I think about the Swash survey and the Gay Men's Periodic Survey here in Sydney, and thinking about how diverse Sydney is generally, and who's actually represented in that survey, and the words that we use in those surveys are very much from that kind of Western worldview and how that's a limitation. But yeah, just thinking about identity and behavior and if you've got somebody who says, I'm a gay man, we've seen in the Swash survey and in the GCPS, even if somebody identifies as a gay woman or a gay man, their sexual practices, what they actually say that they do and with whom, doesn't necessarily match with their identity. What they're saying, I'm queer or I'm bisexual, or if you're bisexual, then that's more clear. But if you're saying gay or lesbian and you're saying that you're sleeping with someone of the opposite gender, we're actually seeing that there needs to be a bit more nuance around how we're asking that. And so in the last few years, Swash actually changed a lot. I mean, I don't have enough time really to go into the full changes in how Swash dealt with not just around the kind of shifts in how people identify and their behavior, but also around including how to actively actually be including gender diverse people, non-binary people in both Swash and GCPS. And actually I'm talking about both of them because it's actually there's the same issue that both surveys have. They're both single gender surveys based in Sydney, and they have different purposes. So Swash is very much a general health survey for lesbian, bisexual and queer women, while GCPS it's for gay, bisexual and queer men, and it's very much focused around HIV and STI prevention and trying to understand risk, right? But both surveys actually kind of did come from the same idea around prevention around HIV, because Swash came out of HIV, and because they found that actually queer women who were or lesbian women and bisexual women were hanging out with gay men and that was in the 90s. And so there was a risk around HIV, and they were sleeping with gay men. And so there was a risk there. So they started a survey asking about sexual practices. So I guess what I'm kind of getting at a little bit, because I don't want to take away too much time from other panelists, is the imaginaries that we have around our population. It's changed so much over time. And I think when Swash started, it probably would have been like a pretty, like, generally static-ish population, you know, lesbian, bisexual women in Sydney and how they connect to the gay community. And over time, it's opened up and been like, oh, actually, let's start asking people are non-binary. Oh my gosh, first time we do that, 6% of the sample is non-binary. Whoops, like, and they're not saying that they're women at all, but they're doing a women's survey. So what does that mean? And same with GCPS, like the first time, I think it was a few years ago, GCPS started asking about non-binary identity in a gay men's survey. And I think it was like a few percent of people. And in the last one, I had it here somewhere, there was, I think, like 2% of people who are non-binary in GCPS, might be 1 point something percent, could be wrong. But what I'm getting at is, you know, how do you deal with, like, if someone's saying they're non-binary, but they're doing a single gender survey, how do we actually support that community? What are the health promotion implications? How do we analyze that data? There's so many questions that come up for that. And yeah, I could talk about it for a long time.
Yeah. I mean,
Julie and I wrote a paper about it, so we can just
put it in. Yes, everyone should read Julie Mooney-Summers' lead authored paper on this, because it's fascinating. I'm conscious of the time, so I want to move on, and I want to start thinking about how we actually do this research. So how should we be designing, collecting and analysing research to be inclusive of sex, gender and sexuality? Now, Bella, I want to really hear from you here, because I'm a qualitative researcher. Numbers scare me, and I've never understood how you do what you do. But, you know, we hear constantly things like the limits of categorization, small sample sizes and statistical power in quant data. What does that mean? How can we be more inclusive of sex, gender and sexuality in ways that actually do what you need to have done at that population level, of that, you know, the high numbers?
So numbers also scare me. I think a lot of people feel that way. This topic, like, I find really, really interesting, especially around categorizing quantitative data and how we do quantitative data on sex, gender and sexuality. And it wasn't until I started working with quant data that I realized how we categorize participants and how we think about analyzing and reporting data actually needs to be done at the very start before you begin designing your survey. It's not something you kind of do afterwards when you collect the data and you go, oh, let's look at this. It's something that is a huge issue that we need to sort of think about before, because without doing that, we might be collapsing and conflating different groups, particularly in sex, gender and sexuality research. And this is a huge issue, and it's something I've come across a lot in my work on bi+ sexual health during my PhD, where I've struggled to find literature and specific data on bi+ communities in particular. In research about queer communities, often categories of people are combined, especially bi+ people who are usually reported together with either lesbians or gay men, or under a wider LGBTIQ+ umbrella. And this is despite all the groups under this umbrella being really different and, you know, different communities. And we talked about before having different health outcomes, like mental health is really different among bi+ people compared to LGBT and heterosexual people. And while combining people for the research focus, you know, sometimes it might be necessary if you're doing something really broad, but without being able to separate the data between these different groups, the distinct experiences of each communities under the LGBTIQ+ umbrella are often missed, and we don't have specific and accurate data about these different groups. Another reason people combine groups is because they don't collect enough responses from a particular group, and then it becomes an ethical statistical issue when it comes to analysis. That's what I'm really interested in, because if you report on small sample sizes, it can be quite dangerous, and it risks making generalizations about an entire group based on experiences of a few. However, if this limitation is properly acknowledged, then reporting on small groups can provide us with detail that would otherwise be missed and might have important implications for specific communities or aspire new avenues of research. So, we could find things that are worth investigating further. But ultimately, as researchers, we should be aiming to honour the experiences of communities who have unique experiences rather than combining them with other groups. An example I see a lot in research that I'm looking on in men who have sex with men is I'll see a study that collects, say, 300 responses from gay men, and then they'll collect 30 responses from bisexual men. And because of this unequal group size, researchers will often, be forced to kind of put them in the same category when reporting the analysis. And this kind of conflates gay men with bisexual men, and we lose the sort of differences between these groups. So really, to avoid having to collapse and conflate categories in research, it's really, really important to think about your analysis beforehand. And I have learned this the hard way in the past. It's really something you really need to consider. And, you need to think, who's the focus of your research and how do you want to report this data? I've worked in the past with community groups about how they want to see themselves represented in research and how they want to see categories of their population presented. It's really important. Is your analysis going to be by sexuality? Is it going to be by gender identity? You really need to ensure you ask the right questions and have a strong recruitment plan, and think about this before so you can gain adequate enough sample sizes for analysis.
Absolutely, because it's not just about missing diverse experiences around sex, gender, and sexuality, but it's actually the harms that can be developed out of that as well. And we've all heard the horror stories about, back in the old days when trans women who had sex with men were upcoded in data to just fall under MSM, men who have sex with men, which is just, it goes beyond erasure. It's actually, it's a really violent kind of thing to do to someone, to sort of just completely ignore their humanity, the way that they identify.
Not respecting.
Exactly.
Not respecting or justifying. Yeah.
It's absolutely terrible. Now, Ashraf, I was going to turn to you, but you did such an eloquent job in the previous question. I actually really want to hear from Angie, if that's okay. So I'm going to jump down and ask Angie a very specific question. How do we adapt methods based on intersectional considerations? So we've got class, religion, citizenship status. That goes beyond just simply sex, gender, and sexuality if they're somehow isolated from all these other aspects of our lives. Can you talk a little bit about how you might go about that, or when you're doing the research that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I really liked what people have kind of said previously about, making sure that you're consulting with communities. I think it kind of has to go beyond consultation. Consultation is really important, but it also has to include, if you've got a research team, if you've got the resources, the research team really should include members from the communities that you're trying to interact with. And what we've done for the national survey is we also have a very large project advisory group, and that includes experts and people with lived experience from a range of different backgrounds. And that's really helped us to make sure that, when we designed our survey, we did all of those things, like we used questions that had kind of been used before so that we could make comparisons to previous research. But then, as Yasik kind of said, lots of those questions were outdated. So what we ended up doing was, we took these questions to queer collectives to get that younger audience. And we also took it to the project advisory group, which had a whole range of kind of people from different backgrounds, just to check that what we were doing was correct. And it was not. And that was a really important thing to recognize.
How does that feel as a researcher to say, we made a mistake here?
Yeah, no, it's really important that we need to do it. And we, I think we were really determined to try to make sure that it was representative, and also it was able to be kind of compared with previous data. It's really important that we have this research has the capacity to be compared against other data, but we can't prioritize that above making sure that it actually speaks to our audience, because it's quite a significant survey. If a person enters into that survey and thinks, yeah, this doesn't speak to my experience, they're just going to exit out and we're not going to have the data that we need. So I think that was a really amazing experience, and we're so lucky to have those communities. And I think if I had any advice for people trying to contact those communities, it's that you know, the people are there. And I think the queer community in particular is such an open-minded and open-hearted community. They want to be consulted. They want to like be included in research. You know, most people really understand why research is important and how it can be beneficial. You know, this national survey will hopefully be able to show governments and other institutions why specific services are so important for this community. And the queer community understands that and wants to help. And so I would just say, you know, find those people. They are easy to find. There's so many community organizations out there that you can tap into. And if you've got resources, pay people as well.
I was about to say
really,
that.
yeah,
Yes.
it's really important. You can't just ask them to do free labor. You have to acknowledge that this is work. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's this notion that people come to research for entirely altruistic means.
Absolutely.
Some people do, and that's
so, yeah,
right.
Yeah.
But then it's the same people over and over again that tend to be involved in this. And then there are those so-called hard to reach populations. Now, are they really hard to reach, or have we just not made the effort to try to connect with them and to get their experiences? Because I think one of the things that's really clear from what everyone has said here is that people are experts in their own lived experience. We can't try to impose meaning and order onto somebody's own experiences. We actually need to let them tell us what's important to them. And I love that the points that you raised there, Ange. Okay, so we're moving along here. Just a quick reminder to everyone who's listening in. Fabulous conversation so far. We do want to hear from you as well. So if you do have questions, please pop them into the Q&A and so we can try to get to them. But I do want to move on to what I think is the last area that I just wanted to touch on with everyone today. And this is about reflexivity. And I think this notion of reflexivity has been weaved into those responses from everyone so far, where you have to reflect back on the researcher's own positionality, thinking about their relationships that they have and the co-production of knowledge. So the relationship they have with their research participants, that together you generate knowledge, useful, meaningful knowledge, right? But it's pretty tricky to be reflexive all the time. And if we listen to those old dead white dudes, we wouldn't have to do it. But thankfully, research has moved on since those days. And so I want to ask, I'm going to open this up, but I'm thinking mostly maybe Heather and Bella, but anyone step in. How do we manage those relationships? How do we manage relationships between researchers and our participants, our communities that we work with people who are in higher positions of power, like in the universities? And Ashraf had sort of referenced the power that ethics committees, for example, hold over researchers when they're trying to do culturally resonant research. So let's end on that big question, I think, because that's a big one. And then we'll move on to some questions from the audience. How's that? Maybe Heather, would you like to kick us off with a response from that?
Yeah, I love that you're closing on my most controversial opinions.
That was always the plan, Heather.
I just want to follow on from what Ange said about members of communities being consulted and involved and on research teams. This is something that I have spoken about quite extensively in the context of research with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations before, but I think it's also something that applies to, I mean, my work is in sexual health, so all the priority populations we work with, LGBTQIA plus people, trans and gender diverse people, sex workers, drug users. I would say that it goes beyond even having people who are members of those communities actively involved in like meaningful roles in your research team. I would say that in 2023, we are past the point where we should have researchers who are not part of those communities approaching those communities and trying to get support to do the research on the topic the researcher is interested in. We are at a point in time where communities need to be setting their own research agenda and determining their own research priorities. And the role of researchers who are not connected to those communities is to facilitate the research that communities want to have done. And if you're a researcher and you're determining that you're not in a position to be doing the research that communities want to have done with them, your role is to find the person who can.
Here, Heather. Like, this is, I mean, for me, this is not controversial. I would hope that everyone listening to this would actually sort of really pick up those nuances that Heather's saying there. You know, while we can never be wholly insider researchers, so we can never fully represent the entire diversity of various identity claims that we make, you know, but we need to sort of reflect back on where we actually sit within that, you know, where's our role in this? And so, Bella, could I get you maybe to comment on that?
Yeah, sure.
Being someone who is championing BI+ research as a BI+ person yourself.
Yeah, it's a bit hard to go after Heather there with her amazing eloquent. I just wanted to sort of mention about some of my experiences working with advisory groups in the past, and I love working with advisory groups. I find it just so amazing. Like in the past and today, I still walk into sort of meetings and I just become sort of encapsulated in awe and inspired by the feedback and ideas and passion community have around research. And I sit there and I want to go, yes, let's do it. Like, that's amazing. And then I kind of walk out and I get back to my desk and I realize, oh, wait, you know, that doesn't work with research methodology or funding or skills we have. So, I mean, the role like you have as someone who's organizing these groups is it's really important to be upfront, have conversations about expectations, funding, sticking to research focus, and making sure that from the start you're having sort of conversations, managing expectations and, you know, the consultation process, as well as, you know, trying as much as possible to take on these amazing ideas and what research the community does want.
That's a really important point. All right, now I wanted to leave some time for Q&A. So while the audience members are thinking up the curly questions for you to answer, we had a couple of questions that came in through the registration process, and these are some doozies. And so I'd like to maybe offer the opportunity to answer some of these. And there's a question here which I think is really good for you to answer. And just thinking about some of the ethical and inclusive research practices and principles that underpin the work that you do, especially around gender and sexuality diverse young people. So what kind of additional nuances, what kind of additional things, relationships, reflexivity, thinking with, all that sort of stuff that you need to keep in mind when you're researching with young people, especially?
I think it will depend on like how young we're talking. I've exclusively worked with young people that are over the age of 18. I think if you go for people who are under the age of 18, that's a whole other level that I definitely cannot speak to. But in my experience, I think young people are actually like really excited and keen to be involved in this sort of research. I think the one thing that I have tried to keep in mind, and I think is really important to keep in mind, is that it's easy to develop really strong relationships with keen, excited young people who want to be involved. And that's amazing. It means that you can get some really rich and exciting data and get some really amazing research outcomes. But one thing you do need to keep in mind is, you know, these relationships that you're building, they can't be transactional and they can't be exploitative in any way. So it's about making sure that boundaries are set. You know, I'm a young person myself, and I have relationships with people who are of similar age that I then engage in research, and that closeness means that they know that they can trust me. And I hope, you know, that I honor that trust. But it also means that, you know, I need to be really careful that I'm never putting them in a position where they feel like they need to be you know, saying yes to being involved in research so that they can continue to have this friendship with me. So I think it's about just making sure that you're like continually checking in with them and being really reflexive about, you know, how much am I kind of asking of young people, even if they seem really like, yes, I want to be involved. Like, it's just important to just keep in mind that, you know, you don't want to be ever exploitative in any way. So yeah, I think it's about just making sure you have strong boundaries.
Yeah, perfect. I mean, I think those principles should apply across
Generally,
the board, right?
absolutely.
But there are just you know, additional ethical concerns. One of the things that I'm really interested in is advisory committees. You know, we often think about young people doing what they're told to do, you know, that they have little voice in these larger political questions and debates. But yet one of the most simplest ways to do that is, right, to have them in advisory capacity, give them agency and respect that agency and understanding what their preferences are and what drives the research interests that they hold. I have a great question here for Yasik, actually. There's a question, it's a really big question. What is the current state of research, promising directions, limitations, and how they may be overcome regarding the health and wellbeing outcomes for non-binary Australians? So this is a big question.
It's a doozy. Yeah,
it is. Let's break it down.
Okay. Look, and I just want to break down the question a bit and just make sure that I'm understanding it correctly. My understanding of this question is that they're wanting to know the link between medical transition and health and wellbeing outcomes for non-binary Australians. I'm imagining what they're saying in terms of medical transition, that they're talking about hormone therapy and or gender affirming surgeries, and especially for non-binary, or only for non-binary people in Australia. I would say that the research out there is very limited. I'll pop into the chat, a little bit of an evidence brief on trans and gender diverse people and the benefits of gender affirming surgery. And this actually does include some information about non-binary people, and it does have some good references in the reference list of that evidence brief, so I can pop that in there. But it doesn't have that direct link between, you know, gender affirming surgeries, medical transition, and health and wellbeing outcomes specifically for non-binary people. So that's something that there is obviously a gap. I did also find some articles adjacent to this, but not explicitly asking this question. It's a study from the US that was looking at non-binary people and the ways that they affirm their gender. But also, again, it's not linking to their health and well-being, but it's, you know, that's also how research works, is like people are working in their little spaces, and together we kind of do create a bit of a picture. I would say that in Australia, just being on the ACON Research Ethics Committee for the last couple of years, there does seem to be a huge push, and there's a lot for research around non-binary people, and we are seeing this there's increasing numbers of research around transgender diverse people that's coming through ACON. But yeah, it's not necessarily just non-binary people though. It's often like trans and gender diverse, and what I'm finding is also that more and more LGBTQ surveys in general and LGBT health research in general is asking for, they're using the ABS standards in their research. And actually I was going to pop into the chat, someone had a question about what's the most common questionnaires, and I would say the ACON community indicators. I'll pop that in there too. But in including non-binary as an option for people to say in generally in LGBTQ health research, it does mean that we're starting to get a bit of a picture. And I had those stats from earlier. I really wanted to say is that in the last GCPS, the Gay Men's Periodic Survey in 2023, there was 2.7% people said they were non-binary, and in Swash it was 8% of the total sample of 1,500 people. I can't say what they were for this year or like last year for Swash, because that really isn't publicly available yet, but it is increasing. So we'll be getting to know more and more about, you know, we'll be getting to know more about the health status in general of non-binary people and as it relates to other, you know, queer and trans people. But there is a need. There is really a huge need to understand non-binary people as a standalone identity, not in relation to other, like the more single gender people, women and men, cis men, trans men. You know, like we need to know about us.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things, is we can't just keep conflating it under a trans asterisk kind of umbrella, because that won't be necessarily appropriate for everybody. And I just also, going back to that question that you sort of touched on that you wanted to answer, one of the things I really love about the Swash survey, for example, is they use a parts and practices kind of model, right, for asking questions. So maybe in the past it might have been, have you had sex with a man in the last 6 months, or have you had sex with a woman in the last 6 months? Now it's has a penis been inserted into a vagina? These are much more relevant questions for the type of sexual health kind of information that you want to get out. But I want to turn a question now to Bella. And this is again quite another doozy of a question. So let me see if I can break it down a bit. So this is a question from a professional who does a lot of collaboration with international countries and teams and institutions. And so they often may encounter non-inclusive language and practices. So for example, where, terminology like people who can become pregnant, and it gets just sort of simplified incorrectly into pregnant women or females who become pregnant, right? So this person wants advice from you about how to approach these situations from a professional standpoint when working with these individuals. And how do you sort of maintain those professional relationships at the same time as, banging the drum for inclusivity and inclusive language?
Yeah, so I would say definitely a respectful approach to your colleague. And I think in these instances, it's really important to have sort of open conversations with colleagues together. So maybe not like a individual one-on-one, but maybe, organize sort of a meeting and a presentation to your team and talk about, why certain terms are used, why they're important for inclusivity, and sort of just lay it all on the table. Because, we were kind of talking about before how inclusive research is, it's constantly an ongoing learning process, and everyone is learning and everyone's at different stages. So, if we take opportunities to talk together, that could be a really good way to keep your team up to date and using best practice language. And that's, an example of that is the term queer. People from older generations, that was a pretty offensive slur in the past, and over time it's evolved to be an inclusive term. So that is, it's a good example to raise about how and why language is important to change, and why we need to be keeping up to date. And another idea I thought of in this situation that could be really useful is a lot of community organizations have developed their own language guides for how to talk about their communities. For example, I know there's some really great guides out there for talking about trans people, for talking about people living with HIV and people who use drugs. And it gives examples of, common language that maybe is not the best and what you could replace it with and why that's important. And that, that's a great resource to circulate around to colleagues if you're not sure on how to have these conversations, and to find those updated informations. And, at the, if you can't get your message through, maybe you could reach out to communities and ask community groups and organizations if you can't find information online.
Yeah,
that's how I'd approach it.
A plug for our COP, our community of practice, is that we're here to answer those tough questions as well. So
yes, exactly.
This is the thing, like one size doesn't fit all, does it? And so, you really have to sort of respond to what's happening in that particular context as well. But the other thing that's a really simple thing to do is just share pronouns, right? As a cis woman, I make it clear that I use these pronouns. So it doesn't make it like it's just a secret language that only trans and gender diverse people, may do.
Normalize.
That's a really important thing. And this is actually a really great way to move into another question that we've got, which I think is a fabulous one for maybe Ashraf to answer. As someone who uses he, him pronouns, but also does this really culturally sensitive work with are often marginalized members of society. The question I have for you is, how do you unpack cis privilege, right? So this is the sort of norms around cisgender identity that sort of are taken as universal in the norm, right? And where it seems like people who don't ascribe to that kind of gender are the ones that are always forced to explain themselves, right?
Yeah.
So how would you unpack your cis privilege in the work that you do and the power that it holds if it's not acknowledged?
I think for me, it's a question of reflexivity. Before even starting my research, I asked myself, what I'm going to do for this community, and what would be the impact of this research, and what's my worldviews are. I mean, how do I look at those people who I'll be doing the research with? So I think the question of reflexivity and self-reflection is very crucial in this case. And afterwards, when I'm convinced, then I go to the field. And before going to the field, what I should do, I mean, in my case, it was like more convincing, having some scoping conversations, trust building, and of course, using the language. I think the language is very important because when I talk to the people in Bangladesh, so I have to use the local dialect, I have to use the local words, and very, not the jargons, not the English jargon that they don't really understand. Even I was not really comfortable in using my pronouns as well, because using the pronouns is considered to be a kind of elitist approach, right? So you belong to the global north, you're an elite. So I didn't really use in any of the correspondences, I didn't really use my pronouns. So I have to be as humble as possible, as respectable as possible, and showing my respect, my cultural sensitivity to the people. And that was a crucial point for me in trust building. So it's not only about the trust building among the community, but trust building with the gatekeepers. So in my case, it was also the gatekeepers who were the kind of a crucial part of my research. So I had to have some sort of pre-fieldwork conversations with the people, convince them, and also I have to be very careful about not imposing any psychological, economic harm. I said economic harm because when I take 1 hour from their life, it's about their livelihood, because these people are from the working class, so time really matters economically. So I have to also go through a kind of strategy, how not to impose any sort of economic harm on them. And then the question of remuneration or gift card came, and I also had to convince my research ethics committee about this. So they're also convinced about my remuneration strategies and so on. So I think when you think about the intersectional approaches in gender, then if you consider socially, economically, in terms of employment, class, caste, gender, and also religion, so there are many overlapping. So a researcher is both an insider and also and maybe an outsider as well. So in my case, when we talk about my cisgender privilege, I might be considered as an outsider. But when I established the communication, the trust building, then they said, well, Ashraf is doing something that will do some good to us. So that was a statement that made me, if not belong to their community, but a close ally to their community. So in this case, sometimes the snowball references also work. My friends, my relatives, people, my network. So my personal network sometimes also helped me in unpacking the cisgender privilege and being close and accessible to the community. Yeah.
Okay. That's actually a really fascinating point that you just raised then, and that actually just made me think about something else. We have another really fabulous question here, and I'm going to put this to Heather and say, can you answer this in 1 minute? Now, this question is around someone who works in the STEM area, and that they're acknowledging that there's a growing involvement of citizen scientists and citizen science approaches, right? In our world, we often think about the terms like deliberative panels or democratic panels. And Heather, you said it's really important that researchers respond to the research needs of the communities with whom they work and they research, not imposing research agendas on communities, especially when they've been oversaturated historically. So I just want to leave the last word with you on that. Is how can we embed a community resident democratic processes in research so that we can actually do good for the communities that we work with?
I was actually just eyeing off that question. So I think my thoughts on this are probably not what you were expecting, but I would say that in a lot of cases, the organizations and networks of the communities we're talking about, so Aboriginal community controlled health services, sex worker organizations, sexual health clinics, they actually are doing research. They just don't call it research. There's a lot of little projects being done and consultations and yarning circles and CQI projects happening all over the place that aren't labeled research because of either historic negative associations with the idea of research being conducted on those communities, or with a kind of feeling that the term research reflects a level of qualification or academic association that these organizations don't have, so they don't feel that they can claim the term research. But to address the question, I would say, like, yes, that absolutely is a thing in our field, and something that I would really like to see happen in the future is the more of the dissemination strategies that we have for official research being extended to these research adjacent processes that are being done within communities, if that is what the communities want, to get greater reach on the findings of their research, so to speak, and to get more eyes on the things they're uncovering within their in that aren't being disseminated in that way because they're not seen as research.
Okay. Now, listen, we've had a bit of a conversation today, and we're fast running out of time. I wanted to let everyone have one last chance to say, what do you want the people who are listening to this conversation to take away from this session today? And I want you to do it in about 30 seconds each. And I'm going to start with Yasik, because apparently, according to our back channel communication chat, they're about ready for bed now.
Yeah, this is definitely
So let's go first.
Think, reflect, go deeper, be critical, go outside your own lived experience. You are definitely missing something, no matter who you are, if you're only thinking from your own standpoint. Be conscious of your standpoint, be honest with yourself about how your standpoint is influencing your research, because it definitely is, even though you think that you've got it right, and you have to constantly be reflecting throughout the entire research process. There's nothing wrong with who you are and what your standpoint is, but obviously we're all unique snowflakes and we have our own special experiences, and we can't be all the things. So reach out, open yourself up to different ways of being and experiences, and respectfully learn about other people's experiences, for the better of people outside of that experience, of your own experience.
Nice one. Fabulous. Okay. Ashraf, last words. What do you want people to take away from you?
I'm just pondering. I think be respectful to cultural specificity, to gender expressions. Have some knowledge on the geolocal context if you'd like to do some research in the global south, because the contexts are different, and that will help you for your research design. By geolocal context, I mean like even load shedding, internet blackout, political unrest, natural disaster, inflation, cash economy, even weather, crime rate, social stigma, like religious environment, etc. And also think about the legal context in the global south of the gender diverse community. For example, the level of incarceration, public nuisance law, or even laws like criminal tribes, etc. So this will only help you to well design your research plan, and also to tailor your questionnaires or interview questions as well. Yeah.
Fabulous. Okay. Bella. Bella from Berlin.
Yes. Inclusive research involves ongoing learning. Be open to learning and continuous learning. Think through your analysis first. I can't express how important that is. And engage with community organizations when relevant and appropriate.
Fabulous. Ange.
Yeah, I think don't be too afraid to get things wrong. I think like most people have already said, we're all coming from different backgrounds, and we can never represent all of the places that we need to represent. But it's about making sure that you're listening and you're being open. And as long as you're honest with yourself and with others when you get things wrong, which you will, then that's the important bit.
Yeah. Okay. last words, as always, for Heather? What do you want people to take away?
I feel like everyone else just nailed it. Like they've not really left me much to say, but I guess emphasizing that these communities that we work with have their own inherent strengths and assets, and like communities want to be consulted, they want to be involved, they want to be engaged. I think the point about not being afraid to ask questions is really important. The project I was talking about earlier about the heterosexual men who have sex with men, we'd been told repeatedly that these were a hard to reach audience who didn't want to be contacted. But when we found them and we said, like, how do you want to be engaged with? The most common response we got was, no one has ever wanted to ask me in a respectful manner about this part of me before. And I think that position of approaching communities with humility and respect and asking what they need of you is going to get you a long way.
Absolutely. Well, we're out of time. I have had a blast. Every time I talk to all of you, I'm just astounded at the level of your knowledge and your expertise, and I always learn something. And so I really hope that everyone else in the audience has had the same experience. This conversation is not over. This conversation will be continuing. So I know that there were some questions that we couldn't get to. Please feel free to email the email address CoPQTI@groups.unsw.edu.au, and you'll get all of us, the academic leads and Izzy, and then we'll be able to send those across to our fantastic panelists and see whether they have any more energy to answer these questions. But this will not be the last time that you see us. We are hoping to develop the community of practice further. We want to really engage with all the different faculties across the university and beyond. And there's a couple of events I just want to quickly flag your attention to. Between mid-October and mid-November, ADA will be taking over the bank, which is the old Commonwealth Bank building, for a residency aiming to promote our research strengths that are relevant to health. And so you will see COP, the community of practice members there for a meet and greet on the 8th of November. And we'll see if we can shoehorn some of our amazing panelists who might want to pop in as well and have an opportunity to talk to them face to face. We're also going to have an online seminar on inclusive research hosted by the Centre for Social Research in Health, where we'll discuss the projects that I guess were the impetus for why we all came together to develop this community of practice. That will be the 5th of December. Please tweet if you'd like to talk about this and continue the conversation at #CoPQTI. And my voice is just about to go, which is fantastic timing. Thank you so very much. And huge, huge thanks to all of our panelists who have devoted their time when they're on annual leave, when they've got their busy lives outside of business hours to come here and talk to us today. And I'm yes, just personally just in absolute awe of all the work that is being undertaken in these spaces. So thank you. Goodbye and good luck. Don't forget to reach out to us if you have any questions. Thank you.